Hello movie barfs and welcome back to the channel. When it comes to the live-action Spider-Man / Peter Parker, out of the main three actors to play the role so far, the first one still remains the best. Yeah, although it's been almost 20 years since good old Tobey first donned the webs, his version of the character is still, in my unprofessional opinion, the reigning and defending champion, for a few simple reasons. Number 1, he's the most dorky of them all. Peter Parker is a nerd. A wallflower, a dork, someone who disappears into a crowd, someone who doesn't get a second look, someone who doesn't get invited to social outings. He's not just your average person, he's deemed below average. He's not a well-rounded guy. He excels only in his academics, but leaves much to be desired in other areas of development. And he sure doesn't have a good social standing with his peers. No other Peter Parker embodies this as well as Tobey Maguire. Just look at him at the start of 2002's Spider-Man. In the first act, we see him ridiculed as he has to chase after his bus, gets mistaken that Mary Jane was noticing him, and gets bullied by Flash Thompson. In just a few minutes of screen time, the filmmakers successfully made him look like a complete dork. And that's one of the more endearing characteristics Peter Parker has. He's the underdog, someone we can easily root for. For Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland's versions, you just don't get that same vibe. They're average at worst, and they actually seem pretty cool to hang around with. Tobey Maguire has that extra factor that puts him at the bottom of the social ladder, and that's exactly the kind of guy Peter Parker should be. Number 2, he has the best family relationships. This one's an extension of his character, but the short version. Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker has the best interactions and influence from Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Just like Peter Parker, the first versions of Aunt May and Uncle Ben remain the best. I might be biasing myself with my preconceived perceptions from the comics, but well, that's just my opinion. With Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, you can clearly see how much of an impact that his family has on his morals and values. It's 100% accurate to say that he only became the hero he was because of the positive influence of his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben's classic line of, "With great power comes great responsibility," was never more effective than in 2002's Spider-Man. Now, understandably, the future versions didn't want to use the exact same line word for word, so they came up with their own iterations. Andrew Garfield's version was something along the lines of, "You have the obligation to do good if you can," while Tom Holland's version was something like, "It's your fault if bad things happen when you can stop them." Both are nowhere near as iconic and memorable as the original. Martin Sheen's a great actor, but I just wish his Uncle Ben had a bit more time to be developed. As for Tom Holland, nothing much needs to be said except the fact that his Uncle Ben is practically non-existent. His Uncle Ben, so to speak, is effectively Tony Stark, and that's not quite how I wished it to be. All we see of his Uncle Ben is that suitcase label we see in Far From Home. As for Aunt May, her influence on Peter is hands down the most developed with Tobey Maguire's version. One of my favorite scenes in the trilogy is how they grieve together when they miss Uncle Ben after Peter's graduation in the first movie. And look at the emotional attachment we see in Spider-Man 2, where Peter learns from her the lesson that sometimes we need to give up the thing we want the most to do what's right. Or how she learns to forgive him after he confesses that he was partially responsible for Uncle Ben's death. Or in Spider-Man 3, where she lends a listening ear and a dose of loving advice after Peter confides his relationship mess-up with Mary Jane, and has to tearfully return her ring back to her. No other Aunt May has played such a pivotal role in the film's plot as Maguire's Peter Parker. You could say the Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland films deliberately chose a different path for creative purposes, but in a way they also had to, because it would be remarkably hard to top the Aunt May and Uncle Ben in the Raimi trilogy. For Andrew Garfield, his Aunt May was generally okay, but that's just it. She's mainly there to fill a compulsory role, but she doesn't get much development of her own and feels very unremarkable. For Tom Holland, his Aunt May is, well, different and not necessarily in a good way. She's pretty much there to just fill a role that's mandated by the comics, although she looks drastically different than her supposed appearance. And a huge gripe I have with her is how okay she is that her nephew is now risking his life day in and day out. Number 3, he has the best romantic relationship. Now, say what you will about Kirsten Dunst, but her relationship with Peter was one of the highlights of the Raimi trilogy. They go through the most challenges, from Peter rejecting her in the first Spider-Man due to him wanting to keep her safe, to her rejecting him in Spider-Man 2 and almost marrying someone else instead. And then in Spider-Man 3, their breakup and reconciliation as Peter goes through a dark phase of his life. Their relationship dynamic with the ups and downs was a key component of what makes Peter Parker the man he is, and it's a huge part of why the character works. For Andrew Garfield, his Peter Parker's relationship with Gwen Stacy was actually pretty good too, culminating in a very emotional death scene at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and they had excellent chemistry with each other since eventually the two of them dated in real life. But overall, I would still regard Maguire's Spider-Man as having the best relationship with his love interest, just a smidge higher than the close second of Andrew Garfield's. As for Tom Holland, well, his romantic relationship was a mess to say the least. His fleeting crush on Liz went nowhere, only to be suddenly replaced by an MJ revelation that comes out of left field at the end of Homecoming. Their relationship in Far From Home felt underdeveloped and forced, and seems to be more of just another temporary crush instead of something to be taken seriously, as with Tobey Maguire's or Andrew Garfield's relationships. Number 4. He has the best struggles. One of the relatable things about Peter Parker is that despite being a superhero, at the end of the day, he's just a regular guy. A regular guy who still struggles to pay the rent and who has to juggle his work and relationships. Throw in the burden of being Spider-Man and everything goes to crap. Just look at him in Spider-Man 2. Imagine being fired from your job, getting lectured for your failing grades, not being able to pay the rent, realizing that the city's hate for you is only going to continue and that the love of your life is now seeing someone else. And all on your birthday. Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker has some struggles too, most notably with the death of Gwen Stacy, but we didn't get to see its full effect in a third film, since The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was a franchise killer. But in terms of the pains and aches of daily life, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker wins by a mile. As for Tom Holland, well, he does have some struggles. I mean, he's living in a poorer part of town and has to dumpster dive, but his films tend to focus more on moving the larger plot along rather than going in depth into his character. Number 5. He has the best character arc. Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker has the most character growth and development, hands down. On top of with great power comes great responsibility, he also learns that sometimes he has to put aside his self-interests to do the right thing. This struggle between his desire for a relationship with Mary Jane and his duty as Spider-Man was hands down the best thing about Spider-Man 2. And in Spider-Man 3, he learns to be grounded back in humility, after he lets his ego get too big from the public's adoration. He also goes through the theme of forgiveness and reconciliation as he patches things up with Sandman and Harry at the end. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man comes in second. I actually appreciate how he starts off as a vigilante solely out to avenge his uncle's killer, and then develops into the web-slinging hero we love. But in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, he doesn't get much development, probably due to how overcrowded the film was. Tom Holland's arc can be summarized as follows. In the first film, he learns that he's more than just his suit, an arc which should never have needed to have been explored in the first place. In the second film, he discovers that everyone has their own failures, and he learns to overcome his own in his journey to continue Tony Stark's legacy. But other than that, the film tends to focus more on the overall plot than his character. So to me, it's very clear that Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker was the most developed of them all, with the most relatable character arcs. Of course, he does have the advantage from having the most number of films so far, but we'll have to see about that when No Way Home gets released. Overall, as it stands, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker still remains the best live-action version we've had in my opinion. He's a complete dork, which is exactly how he should be based on the source material. He has the best family and relationship dynamics, the most relatable struggles, along with the most developed character arc. He's without a doubt the most accurate depiction of Stan Lee's vision of the character. When it comes to the live-action version of Peter Parker, they hit a home run with the first. Thanks for watching, folks. Now, which version of Peter Parker worked best for you? Did you agree or disagree on any of the points I made? Let me know in the comments below. Ending it here, be sure to like the video if you got anything out of it, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.